Storybook title, Kate's Domination Part 4. Written and copyright by A.A. Caster. Narrated by Hazel. Welcome everyone to A.A. Caster Book Club. Today's story is Kate's Domination. Prepare yourselves for a provocative journey into the mind of a woman who finds power and pleasure in absolute control. This tale delves into the intense dynamics between a young woman and the men who willingly submit to her, exploring the boundaries of dominance, submission, and the darker aspects of human desire. Be ready for a narrative that challenges the conventional, pushing the limits of power and obedience in a way that is both captivating and unsettling. Scene 30, The Wedding Night. The soft glow of candlelight filled the room as James and Jane finally retreated to the privacy of their honeymoon suite. The night had been a whirlwind of emotions and celebration, and now, as the door clicked shut behind them, James felt a surge of excitement. This was the moment he had been waiting for, their first night together as husband and wife. James turned to Jane, his eyes shining with love and desire. He had always imagined what this night would be like, and now that it was here, he couldn't contain his joy. "You're so beautiful, Jane," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he moved closer to her. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long." Jane, however, was lost in her own thoughts, trying to steady her breathing as she prepared herself for what was to come. "It's a small price to pay for a secure life," she reminded herself, her mind drifting to thoughts of luxury and freedom from the struggles she had endured. "Just act excited, Jane. Pretend this is what you want." James leaned in and kissed her passionately, his lips moving against hers with an eagerness that only deepened Jane's resolve to play her part. She responded as best as she could, telling herself to focus on the bigger picture. As James pulled back to gaze at her, his hands caressing her face, Jane forced a smile, trying to summon the enthusiasm she knew he expected. "I'm all yours now, James," she said softly, though her mind momentarily slipped as she almost uttered another name, Kian. She quickly caught herself, hoping James hadn't noticed her near slip. But James was too lost in his own world of passion to notice. His attention was fully on Jane, his hands moving with reverence as he began to explore every part of her. He kissed her lips again, then her neck, whispering sweet words of adoration as he worked his way down. "You're perfect," he murmured, his voice filled with awe as he worshipped her body. As James knelt down, he gently took Jane's hand in his, bringing each finger to his lips and kissing them tenderly. He then began to move lower, his lips trailing down her arm before he finally reached her feet. Jane watched him, feeling a mix of detachment and mild surprise as he pressed his lips to her toes, seemingly unfazed by the faint scent of the day's events. James's affection didn't stop there. He moved up her legs, placing soft kisses along the way, his touch reverent and full of love. When he reached her thighs, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with desire and admiration. Jane forced herself to maintain the facade, offering him a smile that she hoped would look convincing. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. James looked up at her, his expression one of pure adoration. "Yes, Jane," he replied, his voice breathless with sincerity. "It tastes so good." The room was filled with a soft glow, the flickering candles casting shadows on the walls as James continued his worshipful exploration of Jane's body. But while James was lost in the throes of passion, Jane's thoughts were far from romantic. As James lavished attention on her, kissing his way down to her most intimate places, a cynical thought crossed Jane's mind. "I can't believe he's enjoying Kian's leftovers. What a fool," she thought bitterly, barely suppressing a smirk. "He's practically tasting another man's claim, and he's loving it. What a joke." James, oblivious to her thoughts, continued his adoration, his touch full of genuine affection. Jane knew she had to keep up the act, so she let her fingers thread through his hair, pulling gently as if she were lost in the moment. She moaned softly, her voice carrying the illusion of pleasure To James, it sounded like she was close to the edge, but to Jane, it was all just part of the performance. Just get through this, she told herself, and the rest of my life will be secure. As James moved up, his intentions clear, he positioned himself to join with her fully. Jane's mind momentarily panicked, the instinct to protect herself almost causing her to speak out. She nearly blurted out for him to use protection, but then reality hit her. She was his wife now. She had to play the role, had to be the woman James believed her to be. Instead, she caught herself and whispered, "Wait, James, do you want to have a baby right now?" James paused, his breath heavy as he looked into her eyes. "No, not yet," he admitted, a slight hesitation in his voice. He quickly reached for a condom, the practicality of the situation overcoming his earlier passion. As he prepared himself, Jane felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank God, she thought, I don't want to carry your child. The idea of being tied to James through a child felt like a chain she wasn't ready to bear. This marriage was a transaction, a means to an end, not something she wanted to be burdened with more than necessary. James, unaware of the thoughts swirling in Jane's mind, leaned in to kiss her again, his touch tender as he prepared to join with her. Jane closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting far away from the man above her. Just a small price to pay for security, she reminded herself as the night carried on. Scene 31, Temptation and Tension. Kate sat on the edge of her bed, frustration gnawing at her as she scrolled through her bank app. The reality of her situation was glaring. She had spent all her money with nothing left to show for it except a closet full of new bags, clothes, and shoes. Saving had never been her strong suit. She lived for the thrill of the purchase, not the long-term stability that money could bring. Annoyed by her dwindling balance, she grabbed her phone and dialed Johnny's number, tapping her fingers impatiently as she waited for him to pick up. "Hello?" Johnny's voice came through, tired but still eager to please. "Johnny?" Kate said sharply. "Do you still have any money left?" There was a brief pause before Johnny replied, his voice hesitant. "I'm sorry, Kate. I don't have any left. You've already used up all my savings from my ATM." Kate's eyes narrowed, her tone turning cold and dismissive. "Well, if you had worked harder and saved more, we wouldn't be in this situation, would we?" Her words were cutting, delivered without a trace of concern. Johnny's heart sank, but he quickly forced a cheerful tone into his voice. "Yes, Princess. Don't worry, I'll get my salary at the end of the month. We'll be fine." "Good," Kate replied curtly. "I need that money for new clothes. My wardrobe needs an update, and I can't be seen wearing the same things." "Of course, Princess," Johnny said, trying to sound upbeat. But as he hung up the phone, his smile faded, replaced by a look of deep concern. He glanced at the stack of bills on the counter, each one demanding payment he wasn't sure he could afford. "How am I going to make ends meet?" he wondered, feeling the weight of their financial situation pressing down on him. But Kate didn't give Johnny or his concerns a second thought. He was nothing more than a tool to her, a means to get what she wanted. She tossed her phone aside and resumed browsing the internet, searching for something to take her mind off her frustrations. As she mindlessly scrolled through social media, an ad for an exclusive dating app caught her eye. Intrigued, she clicked on it, and soon found herself looking at the profile of a man in his mid-50s. The photo showed a wealthy, confident man standing in front of a sprawling estate, his polished appearance exuding power and control. The headline read, "Seeking a young, beautiful woman to spoil must be willing to play the role of a little girl." Kate's interest was immediately piqued. The man was rich, capable, and stable, everything Johnny wasn't. According to his profile, he owned multiple businesses, had a collection of luxury cars, and lived in a mansion. But what intrigued Kate the most was his specific fantasy. He wasn't looking for a traditional relationship. He wanted a sugar baby who would pretend to be a little girl, dressing up in schoolgirl outfits and acting the part while he played the role of the doting daddy. This could be interesting, Kate thought, a slow smile spreading across her lips. The idea of being pampered and spoiled by someone who could actually afford it was incredibly tempting. She imagined the luxury, the freedom from financial worries, the endless shopping sprees without having to beg Johnny for money. It's just a role, she rationalized. I can play along if it means living the life I deserve. Without a second thought, Kate clicked on the send message button, her heart racing with excitement. She leaned back against the pillows, already imagining herself in the latest designer clothes, living in a grand house, and never having to worry about money again. The fantasy was intoxicating, and Kate found herself smiling as she thought about the possibilities that lay ahead. This could be my ticket to the life I've always wanted, she mused. All I have to do is play the part. Scene 32, negotiating with Nicholas. Kate lounged on her bed, her heart racing as she saw the notification pop up on her phone. It was a message from the rich man she had messaged on the dating app, the one who called himself Daddy Nicholas. She opened the message eagerly, curiosity piqued. Nicholas had written back with a simple request. "Can you send me some photos?" Kate smiled to herself, knowing exactly how to play this. She carefully selected a few photos from her gallery, ones where she looked cute and innocent, but not overtly sexy. She knew the power of subtlety, how it could drive men wild by leaving them wanting more. It's like presenting a wrapped gift, she thought, amused by the idea, just waiting to be unwrapped. With a final glance, she sent the photos, feeling a rush of anticipation as she waited for his response. It didn't take long. Nicholas replied with enthusiasm. "You look so young, like one of my granddaughters," he wrote, adding a winking emoji to keep it playful. Despite the humor, Kate could sense his growing interest. Kate smirked at the comparison, seeing an opportunity to flirt. "Well, I can be your granddaughter, Grandpa," she replied, her tone teasing and suggestive. She wanted to keep the conversation light, yet full of innuendo. The chat quickly turned flirty, with both of them playing their roles. Nicholas told her about his life, how he was wealthy, owned several businesses, and had everything he needed except the feeling of youth that had slipped away over the years. "I just want to enjoy life and feel young again," he confessed. Kate seized the moment. "What are you willing to provide?" she asked, her mind already calculating the possibilities. Nicholas didn't hesitate. "Money is not an issue for me," he assured her. "I'm very comfortable. What I need is someone to bring excitement back into my life. Someone like you." Kate's eyes sparkled at his words. "This is exactly what I need," she thought. "A man who understands the value of my time and is willing to pay for it." "How about we meet at a fancy restaurant?" Nicholas suggested, eager to take things further. Kate didn't miss a beat. "Sure, no problem," she replied, "but you'll need to pay for my time. I don't do this for free." Nicholas responded quickly. "Of course, how does $500 an hour sound for now?" Kate considered it for a moment, then replied with a smile. "That's okay for now," she wrote, "but don't expect too much for that price. You're allowed to talk to me, but nothing more." Nicholas agreed, his interest clearly piqued by her confident attitude. "I understand. Let's see where things go from there." As she ended the conversation, Kate felt a thrill of satisfaction. She had played her cards perfectly, setting the stage for a lucrative arrangement. The thought of meeting Nicholas in person excited her, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented: a life of ease, luxury, and no more financial worries. This could be the beginning of something big, she mused, already thinking about what she would wear for their first meeting. Scene 33, the dinner meeting. Kate approached the entrance of the 3-star Michelin restaurant, her heels clicking on the polished marble floor. The atmosphere was elegant and refined, the kind of place where the rich and powerful dined in quiet luxury. She adjusted her dress, making sure everything was perfect before stepping inside. The restaurant's muted lighting and soft classical music added to the exclusivity of the setting. She approached the host, her voice smooth and confident. "I have a reservation under Nicholas." The host nodded politely and quickly checked the reservation list. "Yes, of course. Right this way, ma'am," she replied, leading Kate through the tastefully decorated dining room. The tables were set with fine china and crystal glasses, each place setting carefully arranged for a 7-course dinner. As they weaved through the tables, Kate spotted Nicholas seated at a corner table where he had a good view of the room. Nicholas stood as Kate approached, offering a warm smile that revealed his overly white, expensive dentures. He was an older man, clearly past his prime, with thinning gray hair combed neatly to the side. His face was lined with the years, and his body had the softness of someone who had long since left behind the stresses of daily work. He wore a tailored suit that hinted at the wealth he had accumulated over a lifetime, but it did little to hide his portly frame. He was the picture of a retired businessman who had once been powerful but now enjoyed the fruits of his labor in quiet luxury. "Hello, Kate," Nicholas greeted her, his voice gravely but friendly as he offered her a seat. Kate shook his hand, noting the softness of his skin, the slight tremor that betrayed his age. "Hello, Nicholas," she replied with a practiced smile, taking the seat across from him. She was careful to maintain an air of innocence, knowing it was part of what drew him to her. Once they were seated, Nicholas leaned in slightly, eager to engage her. "How was the journey here? I hope it wasn't too much trouble." Kate shook her head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It was fine, but the traffic was a bit of a hassle." Nicholas smiled, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and something more. "Don't worry about that. Next time, I'll come to pick you up myself, or I'll have my driver do it. You won't have to lift a finger." Kate nodded, appreciating the offer. The idea of being catered to was exactly what she was hoping for. As they settled into the conversation, Nicholas couldn't help but admire Kate's appearance. She looked young and innocent, the very picture of the fantasy he craved. The way she carried herself, her soft-spoken replies, it all made him want her even more. "So tell me about your work," Nicholas prompted, cutting into the small talk with a more direct question. Kate sighed dramatically, playing her part perfectly. "I hate it. It's exhausting, and the people are terrible. I just wish I could leave it all behind." Nicholas's expression softened with understanding, and he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. "Well, if I were your boss, you wouldn't have to work at all. You could just travel with me. Enjoy life without any of those worries." Kate's eyes lit up at the suggestion, and she allowed herself a genuine smile. The idea of being whisked away from her mundane life to live in luxury was exactly what she had been dreaming of. "That sounds wonderful," she replied, her voice filled with genuine excitement. The thought of leaving her current life behind was more appealing than ever. Just then, the first course of their meal arrived, served by a discreet waiter. The plates were arranged artfully, each dish a masterpiece of culinary skill. As they began to eat, their conversation flowed easily, with Nicholas asking about Kate's likes and dislikes, her dreams and ambitions. He was careful to steer the conversation in a way that kept Kate comfortable, but his interest in her was clear. He wanted to know everything about her, but more importantly, he wanted her to know that he was willing to make her life easier, more comfortable, more luxurious. Kate played along, answering his questions with just the right amount of coyness, keeping him intrigued. As they dined, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was free from all her current worries, where she didn't have to worry about money or work, where she could live of luxury, just as Nicholas was offering. The meal continued, course after course, each dish more exquisite than the last. By the time dessert arrived, Kate knew she had him hooked, and she was ready to take full advantage of the opportunity. Scene 34, A Walk to Remember. After the lavish dinner, Nicholas suggested a walk, eager to prolong their time together. The night air was cool and refreshing as they stepped out of the restaurant, the city lights twinkling around them. Kate felt a thrill of excitement at what the evening might still hold. As they strolled along the elegant boulevard, Nicholas turned to her with a smile. "How about we go shopping? I'd love to buy you a new dress." Kate's eyes lit up at the suggestion. The thought of owning something expensive, a symbol of her new, potentially luxurious life, was too tempting to resist. "I'd love that," she replied, her voice tinged with excitement. Nicholas led her to an exclusive boutique, its windows displaying high-end fashion under soft, inviting lights. But as they entered, Kate noticed that the clothes on display weren't the typical elegant gowns or designer pieces she expected. Instead, they were outfits designed to mimic various uniforms, clothes that hinted at a specific kind of fantasy. The store clerk greeted them warmly and guided them to a section filled with neatly arranged outfits. Kate's initial excitement wavered slightly as she realized what kind of dresses Nicholas had in mind. These weren't just any dresses. They were uniforms designed for role play, tailored for adult women but styled to resemble high school uniforms, nurse attire, and maid outfits. Nicholas watched Kate closely as she browsed through the racks, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Why don't you try some of these on?" he suggested, his voice gentle but insistent. "I'd love to see how you look in them." Kate hesitated for a moment, but then reminded herself of the opportunity at hand. This is just part of the game, she thought. I can play along. She selected a few outfits and headed to the fitting room, her heart beating a little faster. The first dress she tried on was a schoolgirl uniform, complete with a pleated skirt, white blouse, and knee-high socks. She looked at herself in the mirror, feeling a mix of discomfort and curiosity. She knew exactly what Nicholas wanted, and she was determined to give it to him. Stepping out of the fitting room, she saw Nicholas's face light up with approval. "You look perfect," he murmured, his gaze lingering on her. There was a warmth in his voice, but also something more, a heated desire that made her pulse quicken. Next, Kate tried on the nurse outfit, which was equally suggestive. The white dress was form-fitting, with a red cross emblazoned on the chest and a matching cap. It was clearly designed to be provocative, and as she stepped out to show Nicholas, she could see the effect it was having on him. His eyes darkened with longing, and he leaned forward slightly, as if drawn to her. Finally, she donned the maid uniform, a black and white dress with a frilly apron and a headband. The outfit was playful yet seductive, the kind of attire meant to provoke a very specific response. When she stepped out in this final outfit, Nicholas couldn't hide his pleasure. He smiled broadly, his gaze drinking in every detail. "You look absolutely stunning in all of them," Nicholas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can imagine us having a lot of fun with these." Kate smiled coyly, playing along with the role she knew he wanted her to assume. "I'm glad you liked them," she replied softly, giving a little twirl in the maid outfit. "Which one should I take home?" Nicholas chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "Why choose? Take them all. I want to see you in every one of them." Kate's heart raced as she realized the full extent of Nicholas's desires. He wasn't just interested in her as a companion, he wanted to indulge in a fantasy where she played different roles, each one crafted to fulfill his deepest wishes. And she knew that if she played her part well, there would be even more rewards to come. As they left the boutique, bags in hand, Nicholas's eyes were alight with anticipation. Kate, too, felt a thrill, a mix of excitement and trepidation, as she considered what lay ahead. She was stepping into a new world, one where she could have everything she ever wanted as long as she was willing to play the game. Scene 35, The Expensive Life. A sleek black Rolls-Royce pulled up beside them, its polished exterior reflecting the city lights. Nicholas stepped out first, moving with the ease of someone accustomed to luxury. He walked around the car and opened the passenger door. his movements deliberate and smooth. "Kate," he said, his voice warm yet commanding, "please step inside." Kate hesitated for just a moment, then obeyed. She slid into the plush leather seat, immediately enveloped by the rich scent of the car's interior. The softness of the seats, the gleaming wood paneling, the quiet hum of the engine, it all spoke of a life far removed from her own. She couldn't help but think, if this is just the car, what must the rest of his life be like? Nicholas joined her inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The car glided forward, the world outside becoming a blur as they were cocooned in luxury. "Kate," Nicholas began, turning to her with a serious expression, "are you willing to make me happy?" Kate looked at him, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "In exchange for your company, I want to ensure you're taken care of. No more worries, no more struggles," Nicholas explained. "Would you like that?" Kate's heart raced. The offer was as tempting as it was sudden. "How much are we talking about?" Nicholas smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. $10,000 a month to start. We can adjust as we go along." Kate's eyes widened slightly. $10,000 was more than she'd ever dreamed of making in a month. The thought of that kind of money, that kind of freedom, was intoxicating. "That's incredible," she breathed, barely believing her ears. Nicholas leaned in closer, his gaze intense. "I thought you might like that. So, do we have an understanding?" Kate nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." Nicholas's smile deepened, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "May I kiss you, my little girl?" Kate hesitated, the words both thrilling and unsettling her. "Yes, Grandpa," she replied softly, leaning towards him. Nicholas kissed Kate with a passion that belied his age, his hands tracing the curves of her youthful body with an urgency that had been building inside him for years. The air in the car was thick with anticipation, the tension between them growing with each passing second. But just as Nicholas's hands moved to explore further, Kate gently pulled back, placing her hand on his chest. "Wait," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Before we continue, you need to pay me first." Nicholas paused, his eyes searching hers for a moment before a slow smile spread across his face. He leaned back slightly, reaching into the pocket of his suit jacket. Without breaking eye contact, he pulled out a thick envelope and held it out to her. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Kate took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside, stacks of crisp $100 bills stared back at her, more money than she had ever held in her hands at once. Her heart began to race, pounding in her chest as she counted the bills quickly, the reality of what she was doing sinking in. She looked up at Nicholas, who was watching her with a satisfied expression. The weight of the money in her hands was exhilarating, a tangible reminder of the life she was stepping into. She couldn't help but smile, the excitement of it all mixing with the heady atmosphere of the moment. Nicholas raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Are we good?" Kate nodded, her voice coming out in a breathless whisper. "Yes, we are." Nicholas's smile turned predatory, and he leaned in once more, his hands sliding around the back of her neck as he pulled her into another kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. The deal had been sealed, and both of them knew what came next. Scene 36, Forbidden Flames. Jane reclined on the sun-drenched terrace, the sound of gentle waves in the distance creating the perfect backdrop for their honeymoon. James, her ever-doting husband, had ensured that every moment of their trip was a dream come true. From the luxurious suite to the thoughtful surprises he had planned, everything was perfect. He was the kind of husband any woman would be lucky to have, kind, attentive, and utterly devoted. But even as Jane smiled at James from across the table, her thoughts were miles away. Beneath the surface of her seemingly contented life, a storm of conflicting emotions raged. Because while James was everything she could have asked for in a husband, there was someone else who stirred something deeper within her. Kian. The man who had awakened a passion in her that she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. Her phone vibrated softly on the table, pulling her out of her reverie. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Kian's name. Quickly, she opened the message. "I need to see you. Can you sneak away? Just a quick one. I can't wait any longer." A surge of excitement rushed through her, mingled with the guilt she was becoming all too familiar with. The idea of slipping away from her honeymoon to meet Kian was both thrilling and dangerous, and that combination was intoxicating. She looked over at James, who was absorbed in his book, unaware of the turmoil inside her. Taking a deep breath, Jane forced a casual tone as she spoke. "James, I promised Kate I'd meet her for a little bit. Do you mind if I step out?" James looked up, his expression as trusting and affectionate as ever. "Of course not, love. Take your time. I'll be here when you get back." A pang of guilt tugged at Jane's heart, but it was quickly drowned out by the anticipation building inside her. She leaned over and kissed James on the cheek, then hurried away, her pulse quickening as she texted Kian back to confirm their rendezvous. The short drive to the nearby hotel felt like an eternity. When she finally arrived and knocked on the door of Kian's suite, it opened almost immediately, revealing him standing there, tall and impossibly handsome. His eyes locked onto hers, and the tension between them crackled in the air. Before she could say a word, Kian pulled her inside, the door clicking shut behind them. Jane's breath hitched as he cupped her face in his hands, his lips crashing down on hers with a hunger that matched her own. The kiss was deep, urgent, and full of the desire that had been simmering between them for too long. Kian's hands roamed over her body, slipping under the fabric of her dress as he backed her toward the bed. The thrill of being with him, of indulging in the forbidden, made her heart race. She responded eagerly, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pressed herself against him. As they reached the bed, Kian lifted her effortlessly, laying her down on the soft sheets. He hovered over her, his gaze intense and filled with a longing that sent shivers down her spine. Slowly, he began to undress her, his hands lingering on every inch of exposed skin, as if savoring the moment. Jane's breath quickened as Kian's lips followed the path of his hands, trailing kisses down her neck, across her collarbone, and lower still. The sensation was overwhelming, a mix of pleasure and the thrill of knowing that this was wrong, that she was betraying the man who loved her. But in that moment, she didn't care. All she wanted was Kian, his touch, his taste, his presence. Kian's lips found hers again, more demanding this time, as if he couldn't get enough of her. Jane responded with equal fervor, her hands exploring his body with the same urgency. They were lost in each other, in the heat of the moment as the world outside faded away. Their connection was intense, primal, driven by a desire that had been building for too long. Kian's touch was everywhere, his lips tracing a path of fire across her skin, and Jane felt herself surrendering completely to the pleasure. She knew this was dangerous, that it could all come crashing down around her, but she couldn't stop. The thrill of it, the excitement, was too much to resist. As they moved together, their bodies intertwined, Jane's mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions. The guilt was still there, lurking in the background, but it was overpowered by the sheer intensity of what she felt for Kian. This was passion, pure and unfiltered, something she had never experienced before, not even with James. When it was over, they lay together in the quiet of the hotel room, their breaths slowly returning to normal. Kian's hand rested on her hip, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin. Jane looked over at him, her heart still racing from what they had just shared. "I can't get enough of you," Kian whispered, his voice husky with lingering desire. Jane smiled, though her thoughts were already starting to shift back to reality. "I should go," she said softly, her voice tinged with the faintest hint of regret. Kian nodded, understanding but clearly reluctant to let her go. "You know where to find me," he said, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before she slipped out of bed. As she dressed, the weight of what she had done began to settle on her shoulders, but she pushed it aside. For now, she was still wrapped up in the afterglow of her time with Kian, and she wasn't ready to face the consequences just yet. Jane left the hotel, her mind a tangle of emotions as she made her way back to James. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but the thrill of it, the rush of being with Kian, was something she couldn't give up. Scene 37, The Art of Deception. Jane walked back to the resort with a sense of satisfaction curling around her like a warm blanket. The affair with Kian was no longer just a secret. It had become a part of her. The thrill of it, the forbidden nature, made her feel alive in a way that her marriage with James never could. She pushed open the door to their suite, greeted by the sight of James lying on the bed, his face lighting up the moment he saw her. "Jane, you're back," James said, his voice full of warmth and affection. He got up, crossing the room to her in a few quick strides, and wrapped her in his arms. His kiss was immediate, filled with love and longing. But to Jane, it felt hollow, just another routine she was growing tired of. She kissed him back, letting herself get caught up in the act, but her mind was elsewhere. The scent of Kian still lingered on her skin, and she wondered briefly if James would notice. The thought brought a twisted smile to her lips, a feeling of superiority washing over her. James pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers with a mix of love and desire. "I missed you," he murmured, his hands beginning to wander, his touch familiar, yet somehow dull to her now. Jane felt a flicker of something close to disdain as she looked at him. So trusting, so unaware. "If only you knew," she thought, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and contempt. She decided to take control of the situation, to see just how far she could push him without him realizing the truth. "Lie back," she whispered, her voice carrying a hint of command. James, always eager to please, obeyed without question, lying back on the bed with a smile of anticipation. Jane moved over him, her actions deliberate, almost mechanical. She positioned herself above his face, spreading her legs in a way that felt more like a statement than an act of intimacy. "Make me feel good," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. James, ever the loving husband, complied eagerly, his hands reaching up to hold her in place as he began to indulge her. But Jane's mind was elsewhere, focused on the idea that James was unknowingly tasting the remnants of her affair. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not of pleasure, but of power. "You don't even know what you're doing," she thought with a sense of twisted satisfaction. As James continued, completely absorbed in the act, Jane felt nothing but a growing sense of detachment. There was no pleasure in this for her, just a cold, calculated sense of control. She knew what she was doing, and she relished the fact that James had no idea. He was hers to manipulate, to use, and she did so with a chilling lack of remorse. When he was ready, she handed him a condom, her face a mask of indifference. "Put this on," she said, her tone flat. Inside, she felt a dark satisfaction at the knowledge that she was denying him something he might never understand. "I don't want your child," she thought. "I'll never give you that." James complied, his trust in her absolute, and that only made her feel more powerful. As they continued, Jane barely responded, going through the motions with a cold efficiency that left no room for genuine emotion. To her, this was just another act. Another way to maintain control over a life she was no longer invested in. When it was over, James pulled her close, whispering words of love and affection that she barely heard. She smiled, but it was an empty gesture, one that held no real meaning. Inside, Jane felt nothing but a growing sense of detachment, a realization that she had become something other than what she once was. The thrill of her affair with Kian, the power she held over James, it all made her feel invincible, untouchable. But as she lay there in James's arms, She couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted, that she was no longer capable of the love she pretended to feel. And she didn't care. Scene 38, Lonely Whispers. Johnny sat alone in his dark, cramped room, the only light coming from the flickering bulb above his head. The silence was thick, oppressive, and the loneliness he felt inside gnawed at him like a persistent ache. It had been days since he'd last spoken to anyone, but the idea of reaching out felt impossible. He needed something, anything, to fill the void. His gaze drifted to the drawer where Kate's underwear lay hidden, a strange gift from Kian, who had handed it over with a smirk, saying it was a good luck charm. Johnny didn't care about Kian's intentions anymore. He just needed to feel close to Kate, even if it was only in his mind. With trembling hands, Johnny opened the drawer and pulled out the underwear. The fabric felt soft against his fingers, almost delicate, and he brought it to his face, closing his eyes as he inhaled deeply. The scent was faint, but it was enough to ignite his imagination. He could almost see Kate standing in front of him, her eyes warm, her smile gentle. "Kate," he whispered, his voice quivering with desperation, "I knew you'd come to see me." He stood up slowly, the room spinning slightly as he imagined her right there with him. But as he moved, the underwear slipped from his hands and fell to the floor. Panic seized him for a moment, and he quickly picked it up, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline. "Don't leave me," he muttered almost to himself. "Please don't leave me alone." He carefully placed the underwear on his head, adjusting it so the scent lingered under his nose. He breathed in deeply, feeling a twisted sense of comfort as the smell filled his senses. "Kate," he said again, this time more confidently, as if she were truly there. "You look so beautiful tonight. I knew you'd come back for me." He started to pace the room, talking to the empty air as if Kate were standing right beside him, listening to every word. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about us," he said, his voice growing more animated. "I know you're with Kian, but I think we could be something special. Don't you think so?" He paused, waiting for an answer that would never come, then continued as if she had responded. "I knew you'd agree," he said with a pathetic, lopsided grin. "You've always been so kind to me, Kate, not like the others. You see me for who I really am, don't you?" The room seemed to close in on him as his fantasy grew darker, more twisted. His eyes fell on a pair of Kate's old slippers, left behind after a visit to Kian's place. He knelt down, picking them up with reverence, as if they were some holy relic. "I've missed you so much," he whispered to the slippers, his voice barely audible. "I can't stop thinking about you. Every night, every day, you're always in my mind." He leaned in, pressing his lips to the worn fabric, his breath shaky and uneven. The taste was bitter, unpleasant, but he didn't care. It was Kate's, and that was all that mattered. "Do you like this, Princess?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with a sick desperation. "Do you like it when I do this for you?" He licked the slippers again, this time more slowly, savoring the moment as if it were something precious. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of shame and twisted pleasure flooding his senses. "You've always been so sweet to me, Kate," he continued, his voice growing more unhinged, "so gentle, so loving. I knew you cared about me. I knew you'd come back." In his mind, Kate was smiling at him, her eyes filled with affection. She was saying all the things he longed to hear, telling him that she had always loved him, that she had been waiting for the right moment to confess her feelings. "I knew it," he muttered to himself, tears welling up in his eyes. "I knew you felt the same way." He clutched the slippers to his chest, rocking back and forth on the floor, the underwear still perched absurdly on his head. His tears flowed freely now, mixing with the scent that clung to the fabric, a grotesque blend of sorrow and delusion. "I love you, Kate," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "I love you so much. Please, please say you love me too." But there was no response, just the empty, cold room and the sound of his own pitiful cries. Johnny lay down on the floor, curling up into a ball, the slippers held close to his face as he tried to drown himself in the scent, in the fantasy that Kate was there with him. "I'll always be here for you," he whispered into the darkness, his voice barely a breath. "I'll always love you, no matter what." And as he lay there lost in his own pathetic world, the loneliness pressed down on him like a weight, crushing his spirit, leaving him broken and empty, with nothing but the twisted remnants of a fantasy that would never be real. Johnny dragged himself onto the bed, the mattress creaking under his weight. The room felt stifling, the air thick with the scent of sweat and desperation. He lay back, closing his eyes, trying to shut out the reality of his loneliness and plunge deeper into his fantasies. In his mind, Kate was there with him, more real than ever before. He imagined her soft, warm body hovering above his face, her skin brushing against him as she settled in. He could almost feel the weight of her, the closeness, the intimacy that he so desperately craved. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he imagined her presence, the fantasy so vivid it felt almost tangible. "You smell so good, Kate," he whispered, his voice trembling with a sick blend of longing and delusion. "I love it. I love you." His hand gripped the underwear tighter, bringing it to his mouth. He licked the fabric, the taste bitter and faint, but it didn't matter to him. He savored it as if it were the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, as if by doing so he could somehow bring Kate closer, make her real. "Oh, Kate," he murmured between licks, his voice low and breathless, "you're everything I've ever wanted, everything I need." The room spun around him as he lost himself further in the twisted fantasy. His other hand drifted down to his pants, unzipping them with shaky fingers. The loneliness, the crushing weight of his desires pushed him to the brink. He touched himself, his movements erratic and desperate, trying to find some release from the torment in his mind. His breath quickened, his body trembling as he continued to imagine Kate above him, smiling down at him, whispering sweet nothings in his ear. The taste of the underwear on his tongue fueled the fantasy, pushing him closer to the edge. "I love you, Kate. I love you so much," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Please, don't ever leave me." His movements became more frantic, driven by a desperation that was almost painful. He gripped the underwear tighter, pressing it against his face, inhaling deeply as if trying to drown himself in the scent. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached his breaking point. His body tensed, his breath hitched, and with a final, shuddering gasp, he released, a wave of twisted relief washing over him. For a moment, everything went still. Johnny lay there panting, his body trembling with exhaustion and shame. The fantasy that had felt so real just moments ago began to dissolve, leaving him alone in the cold, empty room. The scent of the underwear, once comforting, now felt suffocating, a reminder of the depths to which he had sunk. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he let them fall, his body racked with sobs. The reality of his situation hit him with full force, the pathetic nature of his actions sinking in. He curled up on the bed, clutching the soiled underwear to his chest as he wept, his cries muffled by the darkness that surrounded him. In the silence that followed, Johnny was left with nothing but the crushing weight of his loneliness, the bitter taste of his fantasies, and the realization that Kate was never really there and never would be. Scene 39, Empty Promises. Johnny sat on the edge of his bed, the room still shrouded in the aftermath of his earlier actions. The loneliness hadn't subsided. Instead, it gnawed at him even more fiercely. He looked at his phone, his fingers hovering over Kate's name. He had received his salary today, a modest sum that barely covered his expenses, but he knew what he had to do. It was routine by now. With a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times before Kate finally answered. "Hey, Kate," Johnny said, trying to keep the excitement in his voice. "I got my salary today." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make Johnny's heart sink a little. Finally, Kate's voice came through, but it was cold, almost disinterested. "Good," she replied, the word clipped and devoid of warmth. Johnny winced at her tone, but tried to push through the awkwardness. Yeah, so thinking maybe I could take you out to dinner? Or, get you something nice? Another silence followed, and Johnny felt the familiar knot tightening in his stomach. When Kate finally spoke, her voice was sharp, dismissive. I don't need dinner, Johnny. Just transfer the money. I have things I want to buy. He swallowed hard, the sting of her words hitting him like a slap. Of course, Kate. I'll transfer it right away. Good boy, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Finally, I can buy something for myself. Johnny forced a smile, though she couldn't see it. I'm glad I can help. There was no reply, just the click of the call ending abruptly. Johnny stared at his phone for a moment, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. A few minutes later, a notification popped up on his screen. His account balance was 0. The money was gone, withdrawn by Kate as quickly as it had come in. He sighed, the weight of reality pressing down on him once again. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the morning. He pushed himself off the bed and headed to the kitchen, where he grabbed a pack of instant noodles from the cupboard. It was all he could afford now. As the noodles cooked, Johnny caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror above the sink. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. His face was puffy, his eyes sunken, and his body, well, he was out of shape, fat and slouched. The sight made him feel even worse, the sadness clawing at his chest like a relentless beast. He turned away from the mirror and finished preparing his meal. The noodles were bland, but he forced himself to eat, each bite tasting more bitter than the last. He sat at the small, wobbly table in the corner of the room, slurping the noodles in silence, his thoughts dark and heavy. How am I going to pay my bills now? He muttered to himself, the hopelessness of his situation sinking in. He had nothing left, no money, no energy, and the one person he thought cared about him had only used him, draining him of everything he had. As he finished his meal, Johnny felt the sadness deepening, settling in his chest like a cold, heavy stone. He put the empty bowl down and stared at it for a long time, the silence in the room pressing in on him from all sides. In that moment, Johnny realized just how empty his life had become. Scene 40, Calculated Escape. Kate sat at her desk, her fingers tapping restlessly on the keyboard. The dull hum of the office felt like a cage, each click of the mouse a reminder of the endless hours stretching ahead of her. She glanced at the clock, the hands moving far too slowly for her liking. She needed a way out. She had no intention of wasting her day here, especially with the son of the company's owner, Mark, in charge today. Mark was young, about Kate's age, and freshly minted as the acting manager while his father was away. He was inexperienced, eager to prove himself, but also easily manipulated, a quality Kate had quickly noticed and decided to exploit. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, and made her way to Mark's office, an idea already forming in her mind. As she approached his door, she hesitated for a moment, then knocked lightly before pushing it open without waiting for a response. Mark looked up from his desk, startled. "Kate, what can I do for you?" Kate stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She gave him a sweet smile, her eyes flickering with a hint of something more. "Mark, I was wondering, could I leave a little early today? I've got some personal things I need to take care of." Mark frowned slightly, trying to maintain an air of authority. "I'm sorry, Kate, but we're really busy today. I need everyone here." Kate let out a soft sigh and walked closer to his desk, her eyes never leaving his. "Are you sure there's nothing I can do to change your mind?" she asked, her voice low, almost a purr. Mark swallowed hard, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. "No, Kate, I really can't." Before he could finish, Kate leaned over the desk, her hand sliding across the polished wood until it rested lightly on his thigh. She watched his reaction carefully, her smile turning sly. "How about if I make it worth your while?" she whispered, her hand moving up, pressing against him in a way that made her intentions unmistakable. Mark's breath hitched, and he stared at her, caught between shock and desire. He didn't say anything, but his lack of resistance was all the answer Kate needed. Without a word, she moved around the desk, her hands still guiding him, and knelt in front of him. She glanced up, meeting his eyes with a knowing look, and then she began to pleasure him, her movements deliberate and practiced. Mark gasped, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he gave in to the moment. Kate kept her eyes locked on his, reading every flicker of emotion as she continued. Mark's breath grew ragged, and within moments he reached his limit. He released with a shudder, and Kate took it all, her expression unreadable as she finished. She stood up slowly, wiping the corner of her mouth with a practiced flick of her wrist. Mark slumped back in his chair, breathless and dazed, clearly overwhelmed by what had just happened. Kate smiled at him, sweetly and innocently, as if nothing had happened. "Thank you, Mark. I'll be leaving now." Mark could only nod, still too stunned to speak. Kate turned and walked out of the office, her steps confident and unhurried, as if she hadn't just secured her early exit through the most unorthodox of methods.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, please share this podcast with your friends and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to visit my website at www.tonyc.info for more content, updates, and exclusive behind-the-scenes insights. This podcast is mainly supported by listeners like you. If you want to help keep the stories coming, consider supporting me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/JTAC. Even just $1 a month makes a huge difference and helps me continue to create the content you love. Thank you again for listening. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, stay safe and keep exploring the unknown.